So after 45 years, I may not have a lot of insight, but I have a lot of mileage. Let me pick up the question that the gentleman asked and add to the confusion. We actually do both. NSA has a broad, sweeping set of programs they call CNO, Computer Network Operations, and it consists of two components: Computer Network Defense, Computer Network Attack. And you can actually Google this and see what they do. And indeed, the analysts and the contractors, not just for NSA, but others that are in DNI and some of the other system organizations, do exactly that. And in fact, there's almost no defensive idea that you bring to the hardcore parts of the intelligence community where they say, okay, now let's figure out how to turn it around. So they do live hand in hand. Well, whether they should or they shouldn't is maybe debatable, but they do, and they have for a long time. I do want to acknowledge how serious this is, but I also don't want to insert too much fear and doomsday attitude around it, because there is, as Josh said, there is plenty we can do. But the first thing that we need to do, and maybe you can think about this, Governor, for next year, is the person that's missing from the crowd is a behavioral scientist, because, and as Josh mentioned, 80 to 85% of all the cyber problems that happen can be handled with good cyber hygiene that everybody knows how to do. We just don't. Target never should have happened. We don't have all the information yet on JP Morgan, so we don't know exactly what happened. But most of the things that have been in the papers for the last 5 or 6 years, the big ones, Home Depot, never should have happened. They were preventable. So we need to do something about getting boards not only engaged in the game, but to act responsibly and do the cyber hygiene that will take most of this off the table. Now, the rest is what's known as the advanced persistent threat. Those are the things that come from nation states, terrorists, and actors that are very well funded, very highly motivated, and very well educated. And I'm afraid we educate many of them ourselves. Those are the really hard ones to deal with. And there are some tools that, believe it or not, even with the gridlock that goes on in Washington, we sort of snuck in a few legislative tools in the early 2000s, right after 9/11, that do help us. HSPD 7 was a presidential directive that President Bush signed that determined what are critical infrastructure industries and assets, and what is it that you need to do to protect them. Very shortly after that, there was something that most people never heard of called the U.S. Safety Act, which defines and designates qualified anti-terrorist technologies, for which you can not only get the designation of it if you have something special that is a tool, but the companies that sell them and the users that use them enjoy special legal protections if there is a terrorist act that has some devastating impact. So we are doing some things, there are some tools, but we still have this 20% of the APT, the advanced persistent threat. And I think there are things that can be done, but before we do something about it, this is editorial, this is my opinion, it's got a 40-year perspective, but it's an opinion. Most of the cyber stuff that's gone on for 40 years, the resources that were allocated, the funds that were allocated on the basis of fear and anecdote, not specific analysis of what is the exposure and how do you fix it, right? Lord Kelvin told us to measure is to know, and we have yet to develop a good process to really measure the impact of cyber incidents in terms that are very meaningful. We have always, and I started out as a cyber geek, I even own a pocket protector, so I'm not being harsh to anybody here, but cyber people have always looked at this problem through the lens of the wiring closet, not through the lens of the boardroom or the state house or the citizens. And we have to learn how to do that. But in order to do that, we also have to appreciate what cyberspace is so that we can learn how to measure what is the exposure and what are the consequences. And cyberspace isn't what most people think it is. It's not about computers and bits and bytes anymore. In fact, it's about this silly little thing has 17 radios and sensors in it. It's not just computers. It's not just wires, because everything is wireless. The cyber that we talk about now, 20 years ago, was sort of on the side of the business or the operation, supporting it. It's now baked into it. It's not on the side of it, it's part of it. The whole thing together is what engineers call a complex adaptive system. And now with wireless, it's become even more complex. And pretty soon with the thing that we've seen called the Internet of Things, it will become still more complex. It is a system problem, it's not a cyber problem. The cyber geeks, like I once was, I also did system engineering work, so I can straddle both sides. It's not about what cyber geeks can fix, it's what system engineers need to look at first. Fortunately, there's a new technology in town that knows how to analyze these complex adaptive systems. And it was brought to us 75 years ago by Bell Labs, during and right after the war. They actually provided a mathematical structure for analyzing complex systems just like this. And they provided other things called failure modes and effects analysis, where they could take a weapon system that had 500,000 parts in it and predict the mean time to failure down to the minute. That was pretty good back then. Imagine if we brought that approach to looking at a complex system, brought that forward to look at the complex cyber world we have. We could start to get our arms around measuring the impact of a cyber incident. And when we measure it, we know more about how to deal with it. And how should we measure it? Let's go to HSPD 7. What that presidential directive said is that let's look at the impact on critical infrastructure in terms of its financial, public safety, and public confidence impacts. Well, those are the very things we should be measuring now when we look at a cyber problem and say, what are those impacts? What is the value of those impacts? And use that value to drive the policies that we develop to protect our critical infrastructure and our citizens. So what I'm sort of suggesting is let's turn this thing upside down and say it's not a computer problem, it's a complex system problem, and it's a measurement problem from the boardroom and the State House perspective, not from the wiring closet perspective. And if we do that, we could measure, and if we can measure, we could know, and if we know, we could develop policies and technologies that help us deal with that 20%. But first, let's get some behavioral people in there to teach the rest of the business how to do what they already know how to do, and get some cyber hygiene going so we can take most of the problem off the table. That's my message. Thank you, Madam President, thank you.